Welcome to ILTV's Israel Daily. I'm Amit Harari, and coming up in today's newscast, Likud and Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant calling on the government to halt legislation on changes to the judiciary. Meantime, the first Friday part of the holy month of Ramadan passing peacefully amid spiking tensions. And later, the Israeli national soccer team starting its journey to the prestigious 2024 Euro Championship in Germany. We open with yet another shooting attack in the Palestinian town of Huwwara. 2 soldiers were wounded last night in the third shooting in the same town in as many weeks. The drive-by attack came on Road 60, close to the location of the murder of the Yaniv brothers 2 weeks ago and the wounding of David Stern last week. This time, the gunman was in a car and fired at the soldiers who were on patrol securing the road. The terrorists managed to flee the scene. The wounded soldiers were taken to Beilinson Hospital for treatment, one in serious condition and the other moderately wounded. The head of the Settlers Council in Samaria, Yossi Dagan, said this after the attack.
דורש מראש הממשלה, משר הביטחון וכל שרי הממשלה, תתעשתו. אנחנו לא ניתן להפקיר את ביטחון ישראל, לא בשומרון, לא בתל אביב ולא בכל מקום במדינת ישראל.
The army has launched a manhunt to find the shooter. Soldiers closed several roads in the area near Nablus amid a manhunt for the gunman. There is political uncertainty following Defense Minister Yoav Gallant's call to pause the government's planned judicial overhaul. The Defense Minister's dramatic announcement came as hundreds of thousands of demonstrators around the country were taking part in the 12th week of mass demonstrations. More in this report by ILTV's Steve Leibovich.
Political uncertainty abounds after Defense Minister Yoav Gallant's dramatic call last night for a pause in the government's planned judicial overhaul. Gallant cited the tangible danger to state security.
השסע הולך ונפער בחברה, חודר אל תוך צה"ל ואל גופי הביטחון. זו סכנה ברורה, מיידית ומוחשית לביטחון המדינה. לדבר הזה לא אתן את ידי.
Gallant was met with support by several Likud lawmakers and derision from others for placing the judicial legislation in doubt. Gallant's announcement followed Prime Minister Netanyahu's Thursday night speech announcing plans to soften the judicial package, but only after proposed legislation on Supreme Court appointments is passed.
אנחנו נחושים לתקן, לקדם באחריות את הרפורמה הדמוקרטית שתחזיר את האיזון הראוי בין הרשויות. יש לנו מדינה אחת, ועלינו לעשות הכל כדי להגן עליה מפני איומים מבחוץ ומפני קרע בלתי ניתן לאיחוי מבפנים.
The defense minister's announcement came as hundreds of thousands of protesters around the country were taking part in the 12th week of mass demonstrations. As of now, the coalition is still pushing forward, advancing the legislation in the Law Committee. Coalition Whip Ophir Katz says whoever does not vote for the judicial overhaul has ended his career in the Likud. But in addition to Gallant, Likud MKs Edelstein and Biton and ministers Barkat and Dichter are also hinting at a desire to pause the legislation, and a coalition majority may not be a certainty. Prime Minister Netanyahu now has a political choice to make: pause the judicial overhaul or face the possibility that the bill will not pass its third reading in the Knesset. The coalition is waiting for direction, and that means decision time for Netanyahu. The opposition protests are continuing, with promises of disruptions now on a daily basis.
Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu returned home this morning after a weekend trip to London for talks with British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, somewhat overshadowed by domestic issues back in Israel. ILTV's William Sharon reports.
After the Friday meeting, the Israeli Prime Minister's office said the conversation focused on Iran's nuclear threat, and he thanked the British leader for his position, but asked that more pressure be applied on Tehran. Sunk's office said that the two leaders agreed to continue working closely together to push back against Iranian aggression and manage the risk of Iran obtaining nuclear weapons. Netanyahu's visit was unusual in that the leaders made no public statement. In London, Netanyahu faced hundreds of protesters calling for an end to the planned judicial overhaul in Israel.
With these protests, the Israeli government and other elements within Israeli society will understand how strong the opposition is to this, and hopefully, this will serve to mobilize others and also mobilize elements within the government and within the Knesset to oppose this legislation.
Prime Minister Sang's office said that Sang stressed to Netanyahu the importance of upholding the democratic values that underpin our relationship, including in the proposed judicial reforms in Israel. The statement for 10th Downing Street also stressed the international concern at growing tensions in the Palestinian territories and encouraged all efforts to de-escalate.
In these days of political decision-making, we're pleased to be joined by the always well-informed Alex Trayman, journalist and JNS bureau chief. Alex, Defense Minister Gallant, he made a statement citing the tangible danger to state security if the judicial overhaul is not paused. What were his motivations and what is now his political fate?
Well, Gallant has heard calls from within inside many of the ranks of the military, including some senior reservists who have threatened not to show up for duty or not to show up for reserve duty if the judicial overhaul becomes passed. Essentially, they are politicizing the IDF, Israeli Defense Forces, which is a red line that seems to have now been crossed. For Gallant, it's very tenuous these next several hours. The Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, has to decide whether to fire Gallant for insubordination, in which he may choose to elevate fellow Likud member Avi Dichter from Agriculture Minister to Minister of Defense, or if he will allow the insubordination to stand, and in doing so, prevent maybe other members of his own party from threatening to bolt the coalition if Netanyahu goes through with the judicial reforms.
And what do we know about the others? Edelstein, Dichter, as you said, Bitan. What do they say meanwhile?
Well, Dichter has basically said that even though he did call for a pause to the judicial reforms, that if the judicial reforms will come up for a vote, that he will vote in favor. He said today that the judicial reforms must, in fact, go through, and it's just a question of timing. And I think that he understands that if Gallant will be fired, that he can then take his desired position as defense minister. It looks like the only other major possibility to defect away from voting for the judicial reforms, like you mentioned, could be Yuli Edelstein.
And it also seems like decision time for Netanyahu. It's happening now, is it not? I mean, on Thursday he said the first part of the overhaul, the selection of a High Court of Judges, would be passed into law. Now Gallant is calling for pause, and seems like there are enough others to prevent a passage. What are the Prime Minister's choices? What is Netanyahu supposed to do? What is he doing right now?
Well, it seemed for a long time like Netanyahu had the votes to pass any version of judicial reforms that he wanted. But now he's starting to see that even within his own ranks, that there are some members that are suggesting that they would vote against the reform. So putting Netanyahu's success in this issue very much in doubt. And Netanyahu can hear the public calls. He's lost the battle for public opinion on the streets. We see hundreds of thousands and growing numbers out on the streets on a semi-weekly basis now, protesting the reform. So he has basically two bad choices to pick from. Either he can go through with judicial reforms and see increased protests and see increased dissent from within his own ranks, even though he does believe that the judicial reform is quite necessary to pass for the stability of governance in Israel, or he can choose to give in. And then he's basically given the opposition a major political victory and showed them that they can come out in the streets to protest any policy that he may want to implement in the future and find that he will be under the same pressure. And essentially, he'll be neutering his own government one way or the other.
And Netanyahu, he wants to be talking with world leaders about Iran, but everywhere he goes, we're seeing he's met with protests and lectures about democracy. Do you see him putting the judicial matters on hold to focus on the other serious matters on security and so on?